In this demo, I will show how you can use Quali Sandboxes to release your enterprise application in a continuous deployment workflow with CA Automic ARA platform, CA Service Virtualization, and BlazeMeter. Let's first consider a typical enterprise web application with a back-end salesforce integration. One of the features that we want to test is the ability for that application to create new customer leads in Salesforce. Since we don't want to use a real Salesforce account, we'll use a CA Service Virtualization platform to mimic the transaction. We also want to test the performance of that feature with a web frontend that will be deployed and hosted in AWS public cloud. We will use the CA BlazeMeter SaaS platform to generate the traffic. All these elements are modeled in the CloudShell blueprint. So let's review the process step by step. The sandbox orchestration will first deploy all application components, then activate the service virtualization Salesforce endpoint, then configure the application server with the service virtualization endpoint details. Next, BlazeMeter test will be configured with the load balancer frontend IP address. And finally, the BlazeMeter test is triggered to create new leads on the application server and stress test our system. So let's now log on to Quali's CloudShell self-service portal. We'll first run this flow interactively, then use the CA Automic ARA tool to run it in a continuous integration workflow. So I will select a blueprint that will represent my enterprise application under test. Note that this blueprint represents the application under test as well as the BlazeMeter SaaS platform and the service virtualization hosted application connected to the front-end and back-end of my enterprise application respectively. We can check that in the service virtualization client, the service endpoint representing the Salesforce SaaS application is offline. I will now deploy this blueprint. As input parameter, I will select AWS Oregon as cloud provider. Note that I could also select Azure, vCenter, or OpenStack if needed. The setup orchestration will deploy all the application components in the AWS public cloud. Once the setup is complete, I will run each orchestration command individually to demonstrate the flow. In a real-life scenario, this would be run automatically as part of the sandbox setup phase. The first step I will execute will activate the service virtualization endpoint that we saw earlier. Once completed, I can check that this is effectively the case on my service virtualization server. Next, I will configure the application server that was just deployed with the details of the service virtualization endpoint, including port number, API credentials, and IP address. Then I will set the BlazeMeter test with the target URL, in this case, load balancer web address. Finally, I can run the test. We can see the link to the report printed out in the output window that connects to the BlazeMeter dashboard. I can see it's currently being built and the test is running. On the sandbox, I have a live health indicator that tells me the servers are now overloaded with the traffic. And we can connect to the actual web server to verify that the leads are indeed being created against the backend. You can also see that the hit counter is increasing against my endpoint, giving me an indication that the whole system is working end-to-end. If I now go back to our BlazeMeter report, I can see it is now generated and updated with the near real-time performance information. Now that my test is complete, I can tear down the sandbox. The out-of-the-box orchestration will effectively reset all my components and destroy the VMs that were created for the context of this test. We'll now look at how we can insert this scenario into a continuous deployment workflow controlled by CA Automic Application Release Automation tool. In this case, we have modeled a workflow that chains together a Git source control server, a Jenkins build server, a CloudShell sandbox, and BlazeMeter. At each stage of the pipeline, we'll set up a sandbox, deploy the application, and for the performance stage, generate some traffic before eventually deploying to production once each test has passed with success. So let's look at this workflow in the Automic UI. Each stage is modeled with a sub-workflow that contains the integration with CloudShell. I will double-click into the performance testing stage. You can see that we first log on to the API, then start the sandbox, run a BlazeMeter test, then wait for the test result before tearing down the sandbox. If you look at the input to the start sandbox flow, you can see that the blueprint name and cloud provider name are listed. So let's run that workflow. Once in the monitor view, you can see that the sandbox has already started to deploy. So we can go into CloudShell and verify that. So here's my sandbox. And the setup is currently running. So once the setup is complete, I see in the output window that the BlazeMeter test has already started. We can check the test dashboard by following the link to the BlazeMeter UI. Going back to the Automic workflow, the run test step is currently finishing, then the wait for test result will run, and finally the stop sandbox will trigger the teardown. So in this demo, you've seen how Quali sandboxes can help with the release of your enterprise application with integration with CA Automic, Service Virtualization, and BlazeMeter.